Hi, friends. I'm still mindful of the claims that Jesus made in his life, based in his own baptism, of God naming him God's beloved, Jesus naming us his beloved. So I hope you've been living in the strength of that and the power of that these recent days of upheaval, of challenge, of some degree of start of accountability for troubles last week. A week in which we anticipate transition, and we pray and we hope and we want to do our part that it be peaceful transition. But I want to anticipate with you this Sunday and do some broader thinking about our Martin Luther King Jr. celebrations we'll have and the difference that makes for us. I wanted to tell you of a connection I have with one episode, a powerful episode of Reverend King's life. I was recently going through old pictures and came across one of me as a child. It was when my family lived in Birmingham, Alabama, and I was 7 or 8 years old. Picture young Pastor Rich in his leisure suit, preparing for church. That's what the picture was of. Our church was Vestavia Hills United Methodist Church, just a few miles south of Birmingham. I only came to learn later in life, not during my elementary or high school education, but I think it was during seminary or soon thereafter, that Martin Luther King Jr. was jailed in Birmingham. I believe it was 1962, because he was arrested as an outside agitator. The agitation that was going on was that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a national organization, had been invited in by the local organization to help protest unjust laws, particularly ones saying that people of color, black people, weren't welcome to sit at white lunch counters, be in white movie theaters, or any number of other basic rights and privileges that white people enjoyed. Because he was breaking the law in those protests and leading people to do that, he was thrown in jail. These are laws we wouldn't even question. They hadn't been on the books now for years, but he was imprisoned for it. He was imprisoned on Good Friday, so he spent his Easter in jail. While he was in jail, he received a letter from the white clergymen, and that's the exact term, it was men back then, who wrote asking that he please do his part as a leader to moderate these protests, because it was very disruptive to Birmingham. Some of the protests included kneeling in prayer, black and white people together in white churches, tremendously disruptive to congregants who didn't believe that was appropriate. The protesters were boycotting white-owned businesses in town. Imagine, it's kind of like today, hit them in the pocketbook. Imagine how upsetting that would be. And it was taken, these nonviolent protests were taken as agitation and an undue or unnecessary, problematic series of events for the people, the good people they thought of themselves in Birmingham. So they wrote asking him not to do that or not to lead in such a way. I want to share with you a letter that I never even heard about until I was well into adulthood. I was not taught when I was a child there, because I think in large part King was still thought of as an agitator in those days. But this is one part of a very extensive letter he wrote to the white clergymen who asked him to moderate, to be moderate in those days. I must make two confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride to freedom is not the White Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klan, that is, the radical whites, violent whites, but the white moderate, who's more devoted to, quote, order, unquote, than devoted to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is really the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in your goal, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. Friends, we're in an age where we need to hear that word again. We need to remember, though we haven't had tremendous protests for the Black Lives Matter movement, that Black Lives Matter. We need to raise our voices, and we need to never confuse justice with politeness, niceness, moderation. The God we remember in Jesus' own baptism, we still have these elements here on the altar reminding us. The God we're reminded of every time the light of Christ comes into worship is a God who calls us to justice, to righteousness, to service, to nonviolence, resistance when it's called for. So help me, brothers and sisters, and I'll help you move in the direction of Christ as we celebrate this Sunday, an interesting call and an unexpected one to one of Jesus' disciples, and as we celebrate Dr. King. God bless you.